Let's look at our example from the book where we have a commission employee with the attributes of the first name, the last name of the employee, a social security number, the gross sales of the employee, and the commission rate. Now the idea of the program is, for example, we have an employee and the employee is doing some sales, a monthly or weekly sales. The earnings of the employee will come from a commission rate that the employee earns on the gross sales. That will be a percentage of the gross sales. We will need to include a method for calculating the earnings of this employee along with the methods for returning these variables, these instance variables. Wherever we need to call them and use them, we'll need to set and get the values of these variables. We'll also add a constructor for initializing these variables. As you can see that we have declared all the variables as private, and the reason for that is we do not want these instance variables to be accessed directly outside of this class. For example, if we make them protected or public, the protected data members can be accessed from outside of the class by the subclasses, if any, of this class, and that will give them the object of those classes to change maybe possibly the names of these variables. To protect our variables from any changes, accidental or intentional changes, we better make them as private and then provide an indirect access through the set and get methods, so that we can set the protocols for setting the values of these variables in those methods. We add a constructor for initializing the instance variables of the commission employee class. We can see that this is a 5-parameter constructor, and it initializes the instance variables to each of the corresponding parameters. Apart from initialization, we can also use the constructor for validating some of the values for some of the variables. For example, the gross sales cannot possibly be less than 0, and we cannot pay more than 100% commission to the employee, and also the commission rate cannot be less than 0. We cannot have a negative value for the commission rate or the gross sales. Both of these validations need to be performed so that a user accidentally or intentionally cannot enter the wrong value for these variables. So we have added a statement that validates the value of the gross sales, and if the value of the gross sales is invalid, the compiler will throw an exception. We'll add a similar statement for validating the value of the commission rate. So I will copy this statement and I will modify it to validate the value for the commission rate. And if you may, you can add a comment so as to understand what the statement is basically doing. This comment is telling the user or any reader of this program that the following statement will throw an exception if their value of the commission rate is not valid. Now the value of the commission rate needs to be greater than 0 and it needs to be less than 100. So if the commission rate is less than or equal to 0, then that means that we do not have a valid value for the commission rate, or if the commission is greater than or equal to 100, or let's say in this case, in our case, because we are considering the rate of the commission, so we will check the value needs to be between 0 and 1. Commission rate, in this case we can say that we have added the validation statements for the gross sales and the commission rate, and now we can be sure that whenever the values for these instance variables are passed to the constructor, those values cannot be outside of this range. We will also add the setter and getter methods because we have declared our instance variables as private, and to be able to access these variables from outside of this class, we need to add the setters and the getters method. As we can see here, we have added the methods for set first name, the setter and getter methods for first name, setter and getter methods for last name, setter and getter methods for social security number, setter and getter methods for gross sales, and setter and getter methods for the commission rate. We also need to be sure that we have a valid value that is passed to the set gross sales method, and for that we will add the validation statement that we have added in the constructor in the set gross sales method, so that we are sure that even though if the gross sales is passed to the class through the set gross sales method, the validation remains the same. It cannot be less than 0. And same we'll do with the commission rate, that we need to make sure that the value for the commission rate is not outside of this range, this valid range. And for that we will add the statement to the commission set commission rate method. We'll save the changes. Now we have the setter and getter methods for all of our instance variables. Apart from the setter and getter methods, our program also need to has a method that calculates the earnings of the commission employee, and for that we'll add another method that will return the earnings of the employee given a gross sales rate, a gross sales and the commission rate. we'll add an earning method, and this method should return the earnings of the employee, and that is calculated by multiplying the commission rate with the gross sales. And finally, we need to add a toString method so that when we print the object of this class, the details of the class needs to be printed, and for that we will use a toString method. ToString method, as we understand, that is a built-in method and that is overridden from the object class, and this method is supposed to return a string statement in a particular format. We'll set the format using the format specifiers. For example, we want to print the first name, maybe the last name, and we want to do these in new lines. You can specify any format that you like. I want to print these details in the new lines. %s, if you remember, is used for the string statements, and %n is used for a new line. So we have %s, %n, and %s. S needs to be small. So first we set the format that we like, and then followed by the variable names that we want to print using that format. %.2f is used for using the double values up to 2 precision points. So we have these format specifiers. In the first %s, I will provide the detail. For example, this is a commission employee, and these %s formats will print the values in the first name variable and the last name variable. Social security number, so this toString method now will print all of the instance variables in the form of a string. gross sales of the employee, we need to separate these by a comma, and finally the commission rate. If we want to print the commission rate, we can print the commission rate over here. Now this toString method, as we can see that we can add an override annotation over here. An override annotation, as we understand, that helps us or helps the compiler, tells the compiler that this is an overridden method. Now what will happen is it will check for exactly the same method in the superclass, which in this case is the built-in object class, and it will compare the signature of these two methods, and if there is anything that does not match the signature of the, for example, the method in the superclass, it will generate an error. Method does not override or implement a method from a super type, as the statement we can read the statement. So the signatures of the two methods should match. If, for example, we accidentally or intentionally make any change in the signature of the method in the subclass with the help of the override annotation, the compiler will generate an error and tell us that we need to match the signature of the method in the superclass. If we do not use the override annotation, this will simply be any other method, but this is now not the method, the built-in method that is defined in the superclass, that is the object class. That is why we need to use the override annotation, so that we are sure that we are not making any error or any mistake when overriding the method from the superclass. Another mistake can be if we change the number of, let's say, parameters, then this is not the same method now. This is not the same method that is defined in the superclass. If we do not use override annotation, this change will be overlooked by the compiler, but this will be considered as a completely new method now. This is not the method that we have overridden from the superclass or the object class. This is a new method. Now this signature matches the signature of the toString method in the object class, and we are sure, thanks to the override annotation, that we are overriding the method that has been defined in the object class. Although we are completely changing the definition of, or the meaning of, the method that has been defined in the object class, but we are overriding exactly that method. Now that we have completed the definition of the commission employee class, we can create a test class for the commission employee class to test how our object displays the details that we provide using the constructor, the call to the constructor. So we will create an object of the commission employee, and we need to provide all of, so the constructor is expecting at least 5 arguments. So we'll pass the first name, the last name that we have declared as variables with the values assigned to those variables. Next was an SSN number that can be, since we do not have a specific format for SSN at the moment, we can pass any string to that. We can specify a format for the SSN or any variables that we use, and we can validate the input for those instance variables, but at the moment we were only validating the gross sales, which was supposed to be greater than 0, and the commission rate, which was supposed to be between 0 and 1. We want to provide, let's say for example, 6% commission to the employee. Let's print the details of the employee, and we will see that the toString method prints the object in the form of a string. As we can see, this was the format that we specified in the toString method, and it is being printed in exactly the same format.